over to Eric Kloos, our Assistant Director.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. I'm Eric Kloos, the Minnesota Department of Education, and very pleased to welcome you here today on the behalf of our department and the PBIS state leadership team and all the infrastructure statewide. I'm just super happy to see, at the end of the school year as we're wrapping up, having some time to take a deep breath together and really kind of learn from each other over the format for the next 2 days. As we get started, we want to kind of reaffirm our commitments to equity, and this is work, and the PBIS framework really lends itself well to addressing issues of equity within those frameworks at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, as we think about the supports needed to really make progress and gain in those areas of equity. And so the ones we wanted to highlight today is really prioritizing that, and you'll hear this as a theme in presentations throughout. Measuring what matters, and especially making sure that people are getting the effective and evidence-based practices in a very effective way, and going local. And I love the presentations that we're really hearing from Minnesota educators kind of all around the state. So we really have a great format for you over the next 2 days. Next slide. As we get started too, I just wanted to take a moment to really acknowledge what a challenging time this has been over these pandemic years, and to see people that maintain that commitment to students, staff, families, and communities is really commendable and inspiring to us. And, at moments, I can say just personally, to have that support and be lifted up by a broader community, as well as being there to lift other partners up when they need that support as well, is really what community is all about. So kudos to all of you, and even at the end of another busy and stressful school year, to have the time to get together this way, again, just uplifting. So again, thank you for Minnesota PBIS. So a couple quick things just to set some context. Again, things can change so quickly. Again, with a new class of schools ready to join PBIS training, that formal training in August, that will bring us up to 867 school teams to date that have participated in training. So that's a really cool outcome. This slow measured scale, I can in my mind, go back across these years and think about cohorts of teams in training, sitting together in a virtual format, the other ways that we've kept this going, and bringing these effective practices to more and more schools around Minnesota is really commendable. When you see it, the top of each of those bars in any given year are teams that are actively in training. But what you see below that dark blue part of each of those bars are that growing number that are really working to sustain implementation, which is no easy challenge. As school teams change, compositions change, priorities change, all those things over time are going to challenge it. So we're super excited to hear the content, especially Dr. Fielder coming up to think about buy-in and the role it plays in keeping that going. Next slide. Again, here's a map for the visual learners among us to see coverage across Minnesota. Again, we changed the color so it doesn't look like a severe weather map, like it did in the early days, soothing earth tones. But what you see is the shading for districts that are gray that have, one school up to 60% of the schools in the district that have been PBIS trained, formally trained. And the green ones are the districts that have had 60% or more of the schools in the district that have participated and successfully completed training. The dots represent charter schools that have participated in training as well. So neat to see. And again, we've over those 18 cohorts have touched, and we'll be updating both the map and the district numbers shortly. So actually, as of cohort 17, we had impacted 284 districts, which includes charter schools, and impacted 44% of Minnesota students in those schools that have been formally trained. So kudos to that. Amazing to think about the start in, one training room with the first 9 to 10 schools that kind of went through training to get to that point. So kudos to all of you for continuing this work. Next slide. One thing that I wanted to just highlight quickly as we think about it, because we all ask questions about kind of what's been happening during that pandemic and people are putting their best efforts forward. And I really wanted to put a shout out to our trainers, our regional coordinators, and the school teams that trained through cohort 16. And for entering kind of pre-pandemic and finishing as the pandemic still goes on, and seeing that training format for their teams shift between in-person, distance to hybrid and everything in between, whatever was possible at the time, people really stepped forward in amazing ways to make this work. And what you see in the end is that typical trajectory of where they start their training, having a baseline on the TFI, which measures, it's a fidelity measure for tier 1 PBIS, which has given us feedback on the which those core features are in place, which increases the likelihood students are going to benefit from it. So when you can see that those incremental gains over the course of time, despite all those challenges, getting to a finish line of above 70%, that fidelity mark that tells us enough of those core features are in place, we're really going to start working toward and expecting those benefits. Seeing this trajectory, and there were a little bit of nuances in the progression, but in the end, to be able to cross that finish line together as a group of schools that trained under these conditions, again, an amazing result, and kudos to the trainers, regional coordinators, and especially to the teams to maintain their commitment and flexibility during these challenging times. Next slide. Here's one, and this can be broken down another day. I won't get into it deeply, but again, this gives you the history across the past 5 different cohorts of schools that have been training. And you see, again, there's a real commonality to that trajectory. And you see some differences, and especially when it comes to, the year 2 scores, being impacted a little bit under these conditions of the pandemic. We knew it had an impact. We're starting to see and learn what that looked like and starting to think about what those supports are to continue. But again, the super inspiring part of this to me is that, despite those challenges, teams have put in the work, they have action planned, you have seen those core features put into place over time. And at a time where those supports are needed more than ever, that's a super inspiring result. So thank you all for your great work. As we get started, I want to think there's a lot of things out there that, again, part of our work is really to align with things. So as we see new opportunities come around, like Compass, aligning academic and behavioral, social, emotional supports, to really think about what that looks like. Minnesota MTSS and a number of new resources that are being developed almost every day in that way. The Due North plan that really affirms our commitment to really improving conditions around equity. All of those things are out there and in our context. And I know in your schools and districts, there are a number of other ones beyond these as well. But I really wanted to highlight really the opportunity to reach out, to make those connections, how well suited PBIS is as a framework to be really compatible and complementary to all of these efforts that are kind of moving forward. So next slide. Again, I'm super excited about these presentations. We see really a nice range of topics. What you'll also see is representation from educators all around the state and collaborative partners. And I think it sets up real well. Again, we'll be taking, if you want to give us feedback in your evaluations or reach out directly as we think about topics that are really timely and relevant for you as we plan for supports for next year. We encourage you to do so. We take that feedback very seriously, and you see it really reflected in those range of topics that we see today. And I'm going to encourage, again, if you're, one thing I really like about the Summer Institute is that mix of people that are very experienced and those that are just getting started and want to learn more about it. I really want to particularly pull out the exemplar ceremony later tomorrow, at the end of the day tomorrow, to really see some inspiring examples of what that looks like at a school and district level all around the state, and one of my favorite times of the year. So looking forward to that. So speaking of the exemplar schools, I just want to put a real shout out to them now that we are all together. We're going to be in breakout sessions, so we can scroll through these slides, and I won't read off everyone's name. You'll get to hear more of that tomorrow. But really, it is an amazing group of schools. And again, we know there are more schools and districts than those that applied that would meet criteria. We don't underestimate like the time and effort it takes to actually apply for recognition in this environment. But it feels great to recognize the great work that people do every day, and especially during these challenging past years. The role of acknowledging that great work, I think, is more important than ever. So congratulations to those recognition schools that we'll hear more about tomorrow, and to our exemplar districts. So again, we have 5 that are being recognized this year, and we'll hear more about them tomorrow. But I really wanted to give a shout out in advance, and also plug, if you want to see what it really looks like to do this systematically over time at a school or district level, we have some just outstanding examples to learn from in that way, and we look forward to hearing more about them. So a couple of resources. Again, a lot of information is going to come this day. So we wanted to really highlight, again, you'll find resources on the YouTube channel. So you'll have that link. You can subscribe and it will keep you up to date on those resources as they get posted there. We also have the PBIS Minnesota site, which also has content on there, similar way to subscribe and stay up to date with the sessions and other presentations that are there. The PBIS Center continues to generate really great resources, and you'll hear more about some of these in the days ahead. We got this one last year, but continues to be really important and relevant, a school guide to returning to school during and after crisis. So there's a link to that, and digging in deeper. There's actually a recorded webinar that you can access on our website as well that will walk you through that. A couple other ones we really wanted to highlight that are real recent coming out of the National Center: multi-tiered systems of support in the classroom, IDEA and students with disabilities, beginning to address equity in tier 1 systems, wise use of coordinated early intervening services to achieve equity in school discipline, and then the suspensions and expulsions report from the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. So you can see kind of a range of things as we think about really the needs of sustaining schools and districts. They tend to dig more deeply into very specialized topics, and it's great to see a growing range of resources that will help you as you really start to address more deeply some of those topics as well. I mentioned recorded webinars that we've done in the past. We have some more content planned that will be coming as well, but one thing that we did before was really think about really effective practices and how they might adapt in person, in distance learning, or in hybrid. So you see some really great examples. And again, on our content today, you have the opportunity to hear from some of the presenters, Dr. Filter and Dr. Clay Cook as well. So we're excited about those. And 2 others we wanted to highlight is just a basics of the core features of PBIS, using some Minnesota examples, and Charlie Eisenreich is the kind of lead convener and presenter of that presentation. It's outstanding. And also one on a very specific practice of behavior-specific praise, how to implement, coach, and measure the impact of this simple yet specific strategy. So maybe one of the silver linings of the pandemic is we've really shifted to much more recorded content that's both live and continues to be available on demand in an accessible format. We encourage you to check those things out. Again, pbismn.org, a great source for resources beyond the Summer Institute that gets updated throughout the year. And Facebook and Twitter pages as well. So lots of ways to connect and stay connected throughout the year. We encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities. As we transition and get to our keynote, I just wanted to really think again about the PBIS practices that promote equitable outcomes in education. I love the presentations that we have here, and really encourage others to think about sharing their great work with our broad community in the days ahead. We're completing year 18 of working at this statewide, and again, to be inspired by exemplar schools that are newly identified, some that really started training 18 years ago and continue to do an outstanding job. Just inspirational to hear from those talented, dedicated trainers, coaches, evaluators, teachers, all of the above. It's really what makes this work. And want to give a nod to the regional supports, our regional coordinators, the MDE staff that really are partners in this process, and cheer for your success more than you'll probably ever know. We're kind of nerdy enough behind the scenes to continue looking at that data as it rolls in, of impact, of gains in fidelity, of all of those things, and really celebrate those successes. So we really want you to feel our partnership. And really, we believe, going back, just one last item at the bottom of that slide was just, we really believe in teams' use of that data and their access to that data and using that for action planning. And we've seen such amazing things over the years that we really want to encourage that to continue. So in transition, it really sets the table, and we're really excited to have our friend and collaborative partner, Dr. Kevin Filter, join us to get us started here. He has a really broad range of interest, and he's going to come with a really targeted focus for us today, but really want to think about the role that he plays at Minnesota State University in Mankato, but also reaching out with our state leadership team. He helps actively in training for schools that are just getting started in PBIS and a number of other interests. So we couldn't be more excited to have him as a partner in the state and to share his keynote presentation with you. So welcome, Dr. Filter. I have to work to not call you Kevin. I'm so excited to have you with us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Everybody is welcome to call me Kevin. Yeah, so good morning, everyone. I guess I will pull up my slides here. I think is how that's going to work. Let me get that up. All right, hopefully you're seeing that. Get some nods, very good. All right. Well, hey, good morning, everyone. Here we are, just starting summer break, and we're all gathered together for some PBIS stuff. So that shows a bit of commitment to me. So let's talk about commitment, shall we? That's what I'm here to do. We're gonna, the topic is buy-in / commitment, and I'll get into what we even mean by some of those terms as part of our presentation. But let's dive into it. All right. So I think it's pretty universally accepted that we need buy-in in order to be able to implement well, right? People have been talking about this really since PBS kind of got off the ground a couple of decades ago, and has gotten a lot of talk that, hey, it's important. And so what I've been doing is trying to figure out, okay, I believe it's important. Let's figure out what it is and what we can do about it. And it's been a long journey, to be honest, and I'm really just getting started, even though I'm many years into it. So I'm going to share kind of what we know right now. So I'm going to start from this angle. First, when we say we need buy-in, there's a lot to unpack in even that concept. So the first one I'll start with is buy-in to what? What is it that we need buy-in to? Do we need people to be bought into the concept of PBIS, broadly speaking, like the idea of PBIS? Do we need people to be bought into the notion that PBIS is a tiered framework where we provide more intensive practices? Or do we really need buy-in to PBIS as a specific set of local practices? In other words, do we need people to be bought into the actual things that we want them to do? So is buy-in more about the work that people have to do? Is it more about the idea? And the answer, I think, is probably all of the above. But we're going to do a much deeper dive into initially here some of these specific set of local practices, talking about that idea. So I think when people make choices to implement, they're making choices about specific practices that they will or will not do. But after we go down this road a little ways, we will back out and say, okay, how do we understand people's perspectives on those specific things we want them to do? And then we'll definitely get back to this idea of how do you feel about PBS as a concept, and what are your attitudes towards it, and that sort of thing. So when people are making choices to implement, right? So we, by and large, I'm assuming that the attendees here today are involved in kind of school, district, or state efforts to organize efforts to implement, right? We are the teams, we are the leaders in this process, and we provide a system of support, right? We provide supports in the hopes that our frontline implementers, our teachers, our paraprofessionals, Anybody who's going to work with kids directly doing these things will be ready to and excited to do this work. So we provide support that encourages implementation, right? We provide administrative support, right? And, messaging and such with administrators. We do the training and the coaching, right? After we ourselves have been trained and coached on it, we train and coach our implementers in our school, our colleagues, and we arrange resources, right? We make sure that we have the materials we need, the funds we need. So those are the supports we provide. But ultimately, what I think buy-in is really about is this notion that even after we arrange all of these things, we provide training, we provide resources, ultimately each individual implementer, our teachers, our paras, et cetera, are making a choice to implement or not. And trying to understand that choice, I think, is what we really need to get into so that we can affect better choices, I guess, when it comes to implementation. So, okay, so they're making choices. We tell them, hey, here's what PBIS is, here's the idea, here's what we want you to do with the students in our school. And they say, okay, well, I choose or choose not to do that. Well, what is it that they're choosing to do? Are they choosing to do all of PBIS kind of equally, or do we actually see a pattern where the choices people are making in terms of their attitudes and their actual implementation, are they driven more by like a range across specific practices? And that's kind of where I'm going to start suggesting that's probably what's happening. Is there is probably this global, like, hey, I'm choosing to do PBIS generally, but I think even those who choose to do PBIS generally are more excited about certain parts of it than others, right? So I don't think buy-in is equal across everything we do in PBIS. There are some things PBIS related that people are more bought into usually than others. So hearkening back to some very early work I did where we created the very kind of early version of a buy-in measure, I did set it up across different practices. And what we found was there are just some things that people are not as excited to do, not as willing to do, not actually doing. And, certainly areas of acknowledgement, especially when you get into like the idea of tickets and stuff, that's where, we start to get even more pushback than in some other practices. For example, people are more comfortable using praise than they are using tickets. Well, that is a buy-in issue, right? They're less willing or committed to doing one particular thing than others. So I think they're making choices across this full range of practices that are involved in PBIS. So that means I think we should take a look at what is actually expected of frontline implementers when implementing PBIS. If we start from the assumption that their buy-in and their choices probably vary across a range of the practices that are expected to implement, we should review what are the practices that are expected to implement. So this is something that we haven't done a whole lot of in the history of PBIS, is to move the lens of what it is to implement PBIS right down to the front line, to where the students are getting specific practices. We have a really large database all about and resources all about what it takes to organize and implement PBIS, the training and all that sort of thing, the general features. And so a lot of those are what I'm going to call implementation components. That's core. You need to have that. But we're going to start talking about practice elements. Those are the things that those frontline implementers have to do in order to be doing PBIS, right? We can arrange all the resources we want, but if people aren't doing the specific things that are involved in PBIS at the front lines when working with students, then it's really not being implemented. So I want to take a look into that world of practice elements. And when you put those together, that's when things go well for students. So this is not an entirely new idea, right? If you go back through the history of kind of our recent work in implementation science generally, there is a notion that there are at least two different kinds of fidelity of an evidence-based practice. There is implementation fidelity, and there's intervention fidelity. So implementation fidelity is basically, are we as a team setting up the conditions we need to properly for this to work? And intervention fidelity is the notion of, is the work actually being delivered to the target recipients, which are the students in this case, right? So this notion of practice elements being the things that happen with the kids at the front lines being a bit different than implementation components, which are the things that we organize as teams, has some history in the literature. And so My team has kind of done a little bit of work trying to figure out, well, what is it to implement PBIS with fidelity at the front lines? If if it interests you, are some definitions of those terms that I'm talking about. Hopefully those downloads for the presentations are working now. So if you want to take a look at those and pour over this slide and really think about how well we've wordsmithed our definitions, go for it. But I won't spend much time on that slide. Instead, let's do like kind of a more active process of understanding what is an implementation component and what is a practice element. Again, this is all driving towards buy-in, because the general argument is going to be people buy into the practice elements. They don't buy into our implementation components. So let's just think a few of these through. Are these implementation components, which are the team things, or are these practice elements, which are the frontline implementer things? A team meets regularly. Which is that? There's a large enough group of us that I'll just give the answers, right? But I'll give you a moment to think rather than shouting out and making this chaos. I'm going to say that is an implementation component, right? That's not something that the regular classroom teacher is involved in. So that's not intervention fidelity. That's not practice element. That's implementation component. That's implementation fidelity. All right, second one, reminding students of behavior expectations. That's a practice element, right? That's something we're doing with kids at the front lines. That's something that is experienced by the students in our schools. So that's a practice element. That would be part of intervention fidelity. Are we doing it well at the front lines? And by the way, the whole idea is all of the features on here are important to implementing PBIS. It's just which type are they, implementation component or practice element. Administrator supports PBIS. That's an implementation component, right? That's something we as team members ensure is happening to support the front line. 3 to 5 behavior expectations established by the school. That is an implementation component, right? We're generally not asking our frontline teachers and others who are directly working with students to come up with 3 to 5. We as a school will have committed to them. So that's a resource we provide. That's an implementation component. And then lesson plans created around the teaching for that. That's also an implementation component. Reward systems established school-wide so that we have like some kind of universal system for acknowledging students. That would be implementation component. I know I'm not giving enough think time on these. I apologize. I'm feeling like I need to get moving here. But then the next one's a good one. Regularly acknowledge appropriate student behavior. That's a practice element, right? That's something that teachers are doing with students. So let's just look at these two in specific. Reward systems established school-wide, that's an implementation component. That's something a team has to do. But then that translates to the front line as regularly acknowledge appropriate student behavior. So we could go down the list and feel free to quiz yourself when you have some time. But that's a way to think about like what are the things that we do in PBIS that are really frontline happening with the students, and what are the things that we have to do to organize the system to support, which is important because, again, I think the buy-in happens as a range across practice elements. So if we understand practice elements, we can start to actually understand what people are bought into and why and how much. So you have to start with that. So our team did come up with a list of 16 practices that are considered to be core practice elements for Tier 1 PBIS. Very quickly, the process by which we arrived at these was, well, first we got some money from the government to do research, which is always a nice start. And then we worked with experts in PBIS, both research experts and Minnesota practice experts, actually. We took like a few coaches and such from around Minnesota who had a high level of expertise and really big names in Tier 1 PBIS nationally. I don't know that ethically I'm supposed to say who they are, but you probably recognize them. So that's pretty neat. And they were a panel, and we asked them, hey, out of all the things that people are expected to do in Tier 1, what are the things that are practice elements? Like, what are the actual student-facing things that we do? And so they took the existing kind of knowledge base about PBIS and distilled it down to these practice elements. They teased it apart and found what are the frontline pieces of it. And they came to consensus, right? A couple of these had a little bit more marginal acceptance than others, but generally speaking, there was pretty strong commitment across, or agreement across all of these, that these are core practice elements. If you've spent any time looking at these, you'll notice that by and large, this aligns with what we already know about PBIS, right? Domain 1 here is initial teaching of behavior expectations. Sounds very familiar, right? Domain 2 just teases that apart a little bit, and it's the proactive reminding and encouraging after initial teaching. Domain 3 of practices is the acknowledging and promoting school-wide behavior expectations, which notably, by the way, the expert panel actually did say, hey, that means praise for sure, but hey, you know what? You probably do need to go beyond that. And it actually is a core practice to have some sort of token ticket-based logic. Is that controversial? Sure, but hey, the experts were behind it. So I agree. I think that does up our fidelity when we do that properly. And then actually having some sort of an exchange of those. So that was an interesting controversial point. Responding to behavior problems by using a teaching focus is the 4th domain. And the 5th one here, and then we'll move on from this stuff, is completing data used to facilitate this database decision-making. So in other words, as opposed to like a team reviews data and makes decisions, frontline implementers sometimes have to collect data, right? That's an actual practice you have to do as a frontline implementer. You have to document major behavior referrals. You have to participate in a fidelity assessment, those sorts of things. So I did include in the presentation a nice broken out like list of all of these things. Feel free to use these, cite these. They were published a few months ago. And see, where do we get this one? Education, Treatment of Children published this. And we just presented about it at PBIS. It seems to be, it has a little controversy to it, but it's a good start point. So, okay, now we've established what is it that people are buying into. I think they're buying into the actual work they have to do, right? Am I going to be praising? Am I going to be delivering acknowledgement tickets? Am I going to be teaching these expectations? And yes, some of that is global, like PBS generally, but I think there is understanding to be gained by the practice element level of breaking down commitment / buy-in. Okay, so now let's go deeper into this concept of buy-in or commitment. What do we know about it? What's the idea here? It's an interesting thing because I think we all kind of intuitively know, right? Like to the sense that you can tell whether someone is bought in or not, right? Like I think like most of us can do that, tell whether a particular staff member is bought in or not. But in terms of trying to like use that information systematically and do something with it, I found there was some value in really trying to figure out what it is. So before we figure out what it is, it's at least fair to establish that it is something. People talk about this all the time. A very classic study in 2007 cited, they asked a bunch of people implementing in PBIS schools, what is the biggest facilitators and barriers to doing PBIS? And far and away, the biggest barrier people were noting was staff buy-in, right? So we've known that since 2007. So people have been talking staff buy-in for a long time. I don't think I need to convince you that staff buy-in is probably a real experience. But the question is, what do we know about it? What do we know about staff buy-in? Well, have you ever sat and talked to another person about buy-in? Like just like spent like 5-10 minutes even trying to figure out like if you're talking about the same thing, if we actually have a shared understanding of these things. Because interestingly, it's not a well pinned down concept. It's a general usable concept, but here's what I noticed in my initial diving into this topic. First of all, there's a lot of terms that we throw out kind of related to this. Buy-in is a very, very common term. Commitment is a fairly common term as well. Support, do you support what we're doing in PBIS? Agreement, there's definitely some work by Rob Horner, George Guy, where they have kind of said, hey, we need to have 80% agreement before we do this stuff, agreement to move forward that we're willing to do this stuff. And intention is also sometimes a term that we mix together. So are there differences between those terms? By and large, I think they're meant to capture similar ideas, but we'll tease those apart slightly. But mostly, I think they're all referencing the same idea. There is no grounded theory of what is buy-in. What is it made up of? What comprises buy-in? it's there is plenty of information out there about like what is intention, what does it take to gain support for something. But this notion of buy-in as a standalone concept actually needs to be teased apart. So that's part of what we'll do here. We'll figure out what is buy-in, what is it that we're talking about. And then, of course, do we think it's important? Do we know it's important? We think it's important and we experience it as important. But even if it is important, there's still a lot of unanswered questions about importance too, right? Like, for example, it might be important, but how much do you need it? Like, is it really a big barrier? Like, at what point is it really a barrier, right? Buy-in isn't all or nothing, right? It's not like all of our staff are 100% bought in or none of our staff are bought in at all, right? There's this range. Like, we don't know how much that range matters. We don't know at what point you can move forward. We have rules of thumb, 80%, but is 80% a real phenomenon? Is that just a guideline? I mean, it's meant to be a guideline. It's there to remind us, hey, if you have this, it's probably a good thing. But empirically, we don't know if 80% is really like a threshold of any sort to move forward. And then frankly, does that mean 80% of people need to be 100% bought in? Or does that mean 100% of people need to be at least 80% bought in? Yeah, honestly, it's a can of worms if you start really kind of breaking it down. And even if we establish that, yeah, it is important, when is it important? Is it more important when we first are trying to get things off the ground and get initial implementation? Or does it actually matter as much or more in sustained implementation? Does it, we don't know. We don't know. There's just, and frankly, we don't have a lot of empirical studies on solutions. We have a lot of, people talking about what can work, but we really haven't studied it per se. So that's sort of the state of buy-in. That's the, maybe this is me trying to let myself off the hook so that you don't expect me to have just told you everything there is about buy-in, because the truth is there's a lot of issues to be sorted out. But I have been tackling these with some of my colleagues. So understanding buy-in is definitely, or one thing to understand about buy-in is it's definitely not an all or nothing thing, right? There are certain things that are affecting buy-in. There are people that are high in buy-in, low in buy-in. So I just thought about this and I just kind of threw out a bunch of profiles of people who might not be bought in, where they're not a universe, they're not like, a cohesive group. They're not all the same. So we have the prejudiced person. The prejudiced person is somebody who would say, I don't really know what it is and I don't want to find out, right? Prejudging it, no thanks, not my thing. We might have a doubter. I don't know what it is and I don't think it will work with these kids. Oh, I'm sorry, I know what it is and I don't think it'll work with these kids, right? I bet you can think of someone like that, right? They understand what PBIS is, and then they say, nope, won't work. We have the eye on others profile. I don't see others doing it and I don't think they want to do it. Right? So I don't think we're supposed to be doing this. Nobody else is doing it. Why would I do it? That's the eye on others person. The self-doubter. I only kind of understand and I don't think I'll be good at it. I'm good at other things, right? There's other things that I'm good at with supporting kids. And this just isn't something I think I'm going to be very good at. So I don't think I'm going to try this. The my classroom not bought in person. I manage things how I want to manage things, right? So they might know what it is. They have their thing. I understand my job this way and I take control in my own classroom. The misunderstander. Helping kids is more than just being nice to them, right? Well, that's misunderstanding because PBS isn't just being nice to kids. It is good to be nice to kids, but we all know PBS is more than that. Couple of others, the philosopher. This isn't the way to help kids. I believe in, fill in the blank, whatever, Alfie Kohn kind of weird thing you got going on. That was judgmental, but I embrace that because I think PBS is better. And then the time skeptic. This sounds great, but I already have a lot of other things I need to do. So I just don't see how this is gonna, sit on my plate. There's no more room on my time plate. So these are all different things, right? These are all people who are not bought in, but kind of for different reasons. And so I think to understand how those are all bought in issues, we need to understand, well, what is buy-in? What are those? How could we organize that into like the things that are driving people's buy-in? Because it's not all one thing, right? It's not all lack of knowledge. It's not all time. It's a lot of potential things that come together to create buy-in. And please note my note at the bottom there. I made this list up. This is just a thought experiment to help us recognize the range of what we're trying to address here. Okay. So one thing that I think we should embrace in trying to move forward with supporting people through issues of buy-in is the notion that buy-in is not an all or nothing phenomenon. It's not, I am totally bought in or I am not totally bought in. Even at the individual level of an individual teacher, it's not a yes, no proposition, right? It is on a continuum, right? How much are you bought into it? So the question isn't, are you bought in? It's how much. So we have some people who are down in this green zone who are ready and enthusiastic to participate. Those are our, totally bought in, close to that 100% range. Yellow zone people may be willing, but need more time, more information, more support. And then the red people who really, it just feels like they don't want to do it. You have to talk them into it. Right. So it exists on a continuum. So we need to understand that we can't be trying to tackle buy-in as an all or nothing proposition, which means we probably shouldn't like measure it by saying, who agrees to implement PBIS in our school and then treat that as like a good measure of like where people are at, like, because that's just making people say, I'm a bought in, I'm a not bought in. And I don't think that's where we're at. So the question really isn't, are you bought in? The question is, how much are you bought in to all the specific things we plan to do? So how much, meaning on a continuum, and to all the specific things we plan to do, because you might be high commitments, high buy-in to certain practices, much more skeptical or worried about other practices. So already we have to embrace some of that complexity of what buy-in is. All right, so now we still have this issue of what is it? Like, what are the underlying variables that make buy-in? Well, to sort that out, we need to look to existing empirical guidance on what are the variables that impact choice. Why do people make the choices they do? Now, first of all, I am a kind of old school behavior analyst. I really am. I mean, I've got, and grab right off the edge of my, I don't know how much you read that, but equivalence relations and behavior. I mean, I read some nerdy behavior stuff for sure. But I also, when I tried to dig into literature and try to understand what buy-in is, it became pretty obvious to me that the cognitive researchers have gotten a lot more work done on this that we need to appreciate. I think there's a lot to it, and I think it can support our approach. So this is a little bit more of a cognitive lens. Most of you probably don't care if it's cognitive or behavioral. That's just me as an academic trying to make myself feel better. But here's what I think is a really good starting point. It's called the theory of planned behavior. So the theory of planned behavior says this: before we behave, we intend to behave, right? We usually are like planning to do something before we do it. And this is planned behavior. This isn't reflexive behavior. I don't think implementing PBIS is kind of the same thing as like putting shampoo in your hair when you're not thinking about it in the shower. I think it's more planful. There's more effort involved. So we're making a choice to implement things with kids. And so intentions is kind of like, what has to happen before we behave. We have to want to do it. But then what makes us want to do it? What makes us intend to do it? And that's where we go back to the first variables here, which are attitude towards the behavior. So attitude towards the behavior means, do I think it'll be a good thing for me? Do I think it'll be a good thing for the kids? Do I think that particular behavior is going to be a positive experience? Is it going to result in good things? There's a second variable here, subjective norms. Subjective norms means, do I think other people are doing it? Do I think people expect me to do it? That is impacting people's intention. If nobody else is doing it, we probably don't want to do it ourselves. And then perceived behavioral control. That's, do I believe that I have the knowledge and skills and personal ability to be able to do this? Do I have the capacity to even make the choice to do this well? So that is a very well-established theory. It's been around for a long time. And I'm going to share a little bit of good research showing, hey, this is a thing for sure. But to make sure you understand how that plays out, I just put some little labels at the bottom here. So those first three things that come before what I would call buy-in are basically like, sure, I feel like I can and I should do that. So I feel like I can and I should. I have a good attitude towards it. I think other people are doing it. I think I can. That leads to, I'll actually do that. And if we actually say, I'll actually do that, then hopefully we'll get to the point of I am doing it. But in order to get people there, I think we need to start way back on these early issues of attitude, norms, and behavioral control. So theory of planned behavior has a lot of evidence. I won't bore you with the details, but there's interesting stuff showing teachers with high intentions were 5 times more likely to adopt and deliver evidence-based practices for autism than teachers with low intentions, right? So you teach a bunch of people, teachers of kids with autism, to do something, and then you ask them, do you intend to do it? Well, those with high intentions are 5 times more likely. So that means there's something there. A meta-analysis of 123 different interventions for other things, mostly health kinds of stuff, alcohol, drug use, showed a 0.50 effect across a variety of behaviors, meaning it impacts behavior. So we have been looking into a more expanded theoretical perspective on this. We, as a team on Project PACT, you'll see that logo down there on the right. It's a collaboration between myself and some people at the University of Minnesota. Clay Cook was with us for quite a while. He's sort of out of academia now, but Leanne Johnson and Eric Kloos has been very active in this project. He's meeting with us every time we get together. What we did is we said, okay, that seems like a good start point. We want to figure out how to, conceptualize buy-in or commitment. But we need to make sure that fits what we're really thinking. Like, is this the state of the art? Because Isaac Eisen came up with the idea of theory of planned behavior in the early 80s. We wanted to see, is there new and updated information that might help us get a more modern understanding of buy-in? So our team went to, again, another panel of different experts on implementation kinds of issues. And we came up with a slight variation on theory of planned behavior. So I think it's fair to say this is sort of the current state of the art of what we think buy-in is. Maybe that's the best way to say what this slide is. We think in order for you to have commitment to implement, you have to have the bottom 3 things are theory of planned behavior, the green ones. So self-efficacy, which is, I'll break those down. Social norms and expectations and practice attitudes. That was basically theory of planned behavior stuff. But then we've also kind of seen there's this professional identity issue, which seems a little bit separate. Like, is that me? Is that how I see the world? So to understand people's buy-in, what we're really saying is, first, you understand professional identity. And that means, is this thing you want me to do compatible with my philosophy? And you can ask that by specific practice, like, praising kids. You could just do a commitment of praising kids, and you ask them, is praising kids compatible with your overall philosophy of how you are function as like a teacher? Is it compatible with your role and how you function day to day? And is it compatible with your professional workflow routine? Can it fit into the stuff you already have to do? Like, are you so busy that you couldn't possibly do that? And if we wanted to know, and then we guess, okay, we'll find that out. Now let's find out in terms of your choice, your commitment to praising kids, your buy-in to praising kids, how much self-efficacy do you feel? Which would mean, how much capability and knowledge and skills do you have, right? Do you understand what is expected? Do you even know how to praise, right? Confidence in competing demands, right? Can I praise while also teaching and doing all the other things? Very similar to the professional identity, honestly. And then controllability. Is it something that I myself can even make a choice to do? Is somebody going to stop me from doing it? Is someone going to force me to do it? The more that they feel empowered, the more likely they are to do it. And then social norms and expectations is like 3 different things. There are authoritative norms. So that means, does your administrator expect you to do that thing, right? Do I believe that the administrator wants me to praise kids? Descriptive norms means, Is it already happening? Are other people praising kids? If so, then maybe I should. And then injunctive norms means, do other people expect me to be praising? So not just the administrators, but even my colleagues. Would my colleagues be disappointed in me if I wasn't praising kids? So that drives it. And then finally, your practice attitudes is the outcome expectancies on students, meaning, do I think this will help the kids if I do it, if I praise? And outcome expectancy self is, do I expect it will be good for me and my experience if I do this? So that's kind of where we're at trying to tease apart the things that go into buy-in. All right, really rich and exciting stuff, right? And then the last thing I would note is, even after we figure out all of these various things that drive into buy-in, there's still going to be this intention gap, intention to action gap, where yes, somebody's committed, but even a person who's committed or intending or bought in doesn't always do the thing. So we're going to talk about that too. It's possible to basically say, I think all this is great and I really want to do it, I plan to do it, and then never do it. So there's a whole nother variable in there. How do you move people who are already bought in into action? So there's two questions. First, how do you get people to buy in? And then if you have them bought in, how do you leverage that buy-in into action? So there are at least two explanations for people not implementing. One is that they're just not bought in, which is most of what we're going to talk about. But another possibility is they are bought in, but the supports haven't driven them to act yet. So not all problems of implementation are commitment problems or buy-in problems. Okay, I'll make this section kind of quick because I think the good punchlines at the end where we have some suggestions for how do we support buy-in. But if you do want to evaluate buy-in, we've done some work in that, and I will highlight a few key ideas here. First idea is, interestingly, we haven't really had measures of buy-in before, so it's good to start developing them. And that is what Project PACT is largely about, but I've also done some other precursor work on it. And so people talk about buy-in, but we haven't really measured it. We don't have a good enough measure of buy-in to be able to say what works and what doesn't work. So we should be able to measure it. So it'll also help drive buy-in in our own schools. We can figure out if we have it or don't have it. What I think we need to move beyond is the old staff vote, right? Like just a show of hands, who is going to do PBIS? I don't think that's really capturing commitment, because commitment is on a continuum, buy-ins on a continuum. So one thing we did come up with was the planned action and commitment tool, the PBIS. That's funny. I stuck an extra P in there. I'm confusing my two measures. It's the PBIS action and commitment tool, which is the PBIS ACT. So forget that second P. That thing is set up so that we ask people about a few different specific practices. This came out before the 16 practice elements work we did. So it's sort of a rough estimate as to what you have to do to implement PBS. You teach expectations, you prompt, you praise, you use tangibles, you respond to minor violations, you respond to major violations, and you do things in the classroom and not in the classroom. That was sort of an early attempt to figure out what are the separate things people might buy into or the actions we expect of them. And then we ask them, are you doing it? Are you willing to do it? And do you value it? And the willingness is obviously the key variable there in trying to understand buy-in. We did some work on that. The tool came out working fine. Collected data, Minnesota, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, California. Published the data. It's fine. Feel free to use this tool. So here's the thing with the tool. It's reliable. It's not bad. It's a real good start. We used to have a system set up where we could like generate reports for you if you implemented this in your school, you gave this tool. Truth be told, we don't quite have that service anymore because we've shifted all of our efforts into this new tool, the PACT. But I will show you how you can access this if you want it so that you can do it yourself. But some of the things we learned about it is the average commitment when we implemented with these schools, people were saying, we assessed with these schools. We had 84.73% was the mean. So in other words, across everybody who answered, the overall commitment was about 84.73%, close to that 80% mark, right? The median, the middle score, or half was above, half was below, was like 88%. And the most common response was 100%. I'm 100% committed. Luckily, that was only 7.3%. I say luckily from a psychometric point of view. It would be great if 100% of everybody was always bought in, but if you don't measure the range, then the tool is bad. So this does have a little bit of implications. Our first effort at measuring it did show that this 80% thing, it's a good starting point. It really is. To really know if the 80% rule is important, you need to figure out if you get 80%, do you implement well? And we only kind of barely touched on that question. But what we can say is most schools have about 84, 85% commitments. And that's cutting across elementary and middle high school. There wasn't a lot of differences between them. Little bit. I mean, elementary was slightly higher. 74% of respondents were 80% committed. And 80% of respondents were at least 76% committed. So in other words, the average commitment was about 85%, and about 80% of people were 80% committed. This is another way of saying that. If you do want to use it, like I noted, we have discontinued the online management of the PBIS Act. But if you're able to get the downloadable version of this presentation, you can click that link and you can take the tool. The old tool, it has 240 possible points, but it's only, well, I can do this math again here. What do we have? There's 8 sections with 3 questions each. So there's really 24 questions. That's what a person gets when they take the tool. It's just 24 questions. And you can make your own report about it. I found that people don't have too much trouble with that, figuring out a good way to create their own school score. So feel free to download that and try it. Hopefully real soon here, this PACT will be ready for people. We're piloting it right now. In fact, if you're excited to try the most cutting edge buy-in measure in the world, as far as I know, we would be happy to have you and your school sign up for it, honestly. We're out piloting this new measure called the PACT, which is based on all this more complex work that I've showed you. Right now, the tool is very large, but we're trying to design it to be much more efficient. But in the near future, there should be this really cool tool called the Planned Action and Commitment tool that will also hopefully inform like intervention actions related to these different domains. So it's coming. I wish I could. I remember I qualified this presentation at the beginning saying, hey, we haven't figured it all out yet. We're on a journey, and I'm trying to share where we are on the journey. So at least people are kind of ready to tackle the issues and be familiar with where we're at with things. Okay, so the story so far has been, it's important to understand what people are buying into, which is the actual things they're expected to do. I think there's a lot of value in asking people about their buy-in across the different practices involved in implementing PBIS, as opposed to just, are you bought into PBIS overall? So we talked about what those practices are, those frontline implementer practices. And then we talked about what we know about buy-in, which is not a lot, but we know that it is probably complex, is probably driven by various variables such as people's attitudes towards a practice, their belief that others are doing it, their belief that they can do it, their overall idea about what it is to be a teacher and how compatible that is. So all of those things matter, and we've measured it, and you can measure it a little bit and see if you can support it. So that's what we know so far. But I assume what people really would like to hear is, great, but how do we get more of it, right? I mean, that's the question that has been driving all this work from the beginning. And of course, it's the hardest question to answer, because you have to figure out how to measure it first, and you have to understand the construct before you can figure out how to change it from an empirical perspective. But we have some stuff we can throw out there. We really do. It's we're not totally shooting in the dark anymore. First of all, there are a lot of places you can find suggestions about what are good things to do. Like, for example, I just found this on the Florida PBIS website, a bunch of strategies for obtaining and maintaining buy-in. So the reality is these aren't empirically evaluated, but I mean, I don't think there's harm in doing any of these, and some of them will probably work. The questions we care about is like, which ones work best? That's what we don't know. But I think most of this stuff would be fine. So don't be afraid to just sort of look to the existing kind of resources for how to do this stuff. It's just that we don't have a lot of research behind it yet. But let's talk a little bit of more targeted, connected to the research ways of thinking about this. So I have one student right now here at Minnesota State University, Mankato. We have a school psychology doctorate program. I have wonderful students on my research team playing around with these ideas. And one of the things that one of my students, Sammy Cowger, is working on right now is a whole new approach to supporting individual implementers who are struggling with commitment. And she's actually taking kind of a motivational interviewing logic to it. And I'll explain what that is in a little bit. There's a lot of other things you can do, but she kind of broke down understanding the variables that are at play. So really the point of this graphic here is just to remind us, when we make decisions about how to support buy-in, it's good to reference back to what we think is driving buy-in. And that's what this graphic shows us. So in my own work, the project PACT, we talked about these 4 variables. You need to understand and possibly change all of these different things in order to get commitment. Theory of planned behavior is a simplified version of that. The unified theory of behavior change is they're all kind of saying the same thing. So that's good. That means these are probably the kinds of things that we want to target when we create change in buy-in. But then also this notion that once we get intention, we need to make other moves to get action. Once we get buy-in, there's other things we need to do. Okay. So that drove kind of the next few slides. So there are 2 stages at which we're going to have to try to support our implementers. One is what we'll call pre-intenders. Those are the people who are not bought in, and our focus is going to be on creating buy-in. How do we get them to buy in? But then I'm also going to talk a little bit about how we deal with post-intenders. Post-intenders are those who are already bought in, and now our focus is on creating action. How do we get them to act the way they want to act? They've decided they want to act. How do we support them? All right, let's talk about pre-intenders first, when we need to get buy-in, right, which is right down the main line of this presentation today. First of all, I did ask this question, I don't say 2015, 16. I did a study where we asked a bunch of people in schools that were implementing PBIS, what things do you think drive buy-in in your school? What things are you seeing relevant to buy-in? And so anything that is really black in this chart means there was a really big effect size, meaning people really think that's a thing. Let me take this back. I'm going to back this up. This wasn't even asking people what they think. This was, okay, I'll make this real quick. It was a buy-in measure. We had people report their buy-in, and then we asked them about these things. So we actually did try to find out which things that of these actually predicted how bought in they were. So there actually is some real kind of stats to this. The biggest thing by far was opportunity to provide input on PBS related activities in your school. Voice, being able to say how you feel about it and have some control over it, biggest predictor. Current knowledge of PBIS. As a general rule of thumb, people who knew what PBIS was were more likely to be bought in. So knowledge and voice seem to be 2 of the biggest things that came out. Anything in gray was kind of a moderate effect size. Being a member of the PBS team is probably helpful. In some schools, like in middle school, the administrator had a little bit more sway than we were seeing in elementary and somewhat in high school. But really, the only 2 things I think were really popping on this were voice and knowledge. So let's start with that. Those seem like things we could target, right? And with a little bit of empirical support. We want to first ensure that our staff have a voice in the process. These are generic solutions, right? These aren't targeted to specific problems. These are just things that we think drive buy-in generally. Ensure your staff have voice in the process. If your school is low on buy-in, make sure people are able to express themselves related to what's happening in their school. So they need to see data regularly and provide feedback on their procedures, how they're experiencing it. I know that feels almost uncomfortable sometimes because it feels like it can drive some of these like, complaining fests from staff who don't want to do it. So you might want to find ways to do it that don't necessarily contaminate, right? So like people are able to have voice without having like the minority negative voice be the controlling voice. But overall, getting everybody involved is actually a good move. That seems to be the biggest thing that we saw out of that data set. And then in general, just make sure people do have knowledge of PBIS. And that's what we're already trying to do. So I guess that's just supporting the work we're already trying to do, but make sure they know why we're doing it, what they're expected to do, right? So that's those practice elements we talked about earlier. And then what we expect to see as outcomes, what actually happens when you do PBS well. Make sure they have knowledge, make sure they have voice. Okay, so those are the general solutions. And then motivational interviewing, I think, is another potential general solution. I think the idea here is when you, in a coaching framework, when you find out somebody's not bought in, to be able to take the approach of asking them what they care about, what they want to do in life, and then try to align it with what we're trying to do with PBS, and basically have kind of almost a brief focused counseling approach. That's not highly efficient, right? So that takes some effort, and it takes a good coaching model to be able to do that well. So I'm not going to push that too hard, but I do have a student that's trying to work out an efficient way of being able to support people using motivational interviewing. Most of us probably don't know too much about motivational interviewing. So it's more of a keep an eye on that, because 5 years from now, that might be a thing that we're really starting to try to make happen more often. Okay, so now let's talk about targeted solutions. Those are general solutions, meaning you don't even need to know what's driving people's buy-in. They're just things you can try. Targeted solutions means we're going to match them to those variables that we think drive buy-in, right? Which is professional identity, attitudes towards implementation, social norms, and self-efficacy. And here's what we're doing right now. First of all, I'm going to throw out some ideas about this, but hopefully within the next year, we will have at least a really good sense of what the literature is telling us is a way to get this stuff to happen. So our team right now is reviewing, and I kid you not, 18,000 published articles that have some kind of keywords related to any of these ideas and intention and commitment and buy-in. And we're trying to find the ones that really, where people targeted these, so, hey, we have somebody whose professional identity isn't aligned with it. Here's how we intervene. We have somebody whose attitudes towards implementation were not good. So here's how we changed it. None of this is going to be PBIS stuff. This will be stuff probably in other things that we expect people to do other than PBIS. But what's going to come out of this is a really cool list of here are the effective practices for dealing with buy-in problems related to attitudes. Here's a list of interventions that we could use for people whose buy-in is driven by self-efficacy issues. So we're going to get there. We're going to get there. We have literally hired a huge group of students to help us systematically sift through that data set. So that's coming. I'm excited about that. In the meantime, let's just talk what makes sense, right? So we have somebody who has an issue of professional identity. So a professional identity, by definition in our work, is a person's perceptions of whether a given practice or set of practices is compatible with one's professional self-concept. So in other words, is it compatible with their philosophy and with their role? How do you target somebody whose issues are there? I think my suggestion, and I know we're getting short on time, I'll try to make this quick, is have a teacher write down their core personal values in teaching and behavior management and how they like to do it in their role, and then do kind of a coaching back and forth with them. And you can do this in groups too, I think, right? Okay, here's what you were saying, here's what PBS is about, and trying to create alignment with people's already pre-existing perceptions of how their role is supposed to be and how PBS actually ties into that and can support that, so that we're working with their own kind of motivations on their sense of professional identity. Okay, if we have somebody whose buy-in is driven by bad attitudes, they don't think it'll work for them and they don't think it'll work for kids. Yeah. Oh, did I hear recording stuff? Okay. That's a quit the time reminder there. If that's the problem, I think there is, I would suggest sharing data. You've heard that before, right? It's a good idea. Share data about outcomes for students. So published or local examples, let people know, hey, this actually is working with kids, and let us show you the real data. And then, but even more potently, testimonials of from other educators about what has happened when they implement it. That's a bigger thing. Honestly, most teachers don't care that much about our graphs, but you get a well-respected teacher jumping up and saying, you know what, I have implemented this either in this school or a different school. Here's what happened. Here's what my kids are doing. Here's how it impacted me. That drives stuff. So something along those lines is always good. Okay, if the problem is driven by norming, people don't think others are doing it or don't think they're expected to do it. Well, one thing we can do is social proofing, which is basically just sharing data about implementation to show people, hey, look, other people actually are doing this. If you have it in your own school, some implementation data showing people are doing it, just show that. If you have data showing other schools are able to do this, I mean, even just the fidelity data that Eric showed right before we started here in my session, people are doing this. You can do it. It's a real thing. Testimonials from go-to colleagues, I think, is another good thing here again, which I just noted previously, about their experience. Go-to colleagues seems to be a big idea. So it's not just like any random person, but we think there is actually probably value in figuring out who has most influence and then having them talk about like that they actually do it and it's expected that everybody else do it. And then definitely getting a clear statement from administrators that, hey, we're all supposed to be doing this. Those things would help with the social norming issues. Self-efficacy issues, those who don't believe they're going to be good at it or can do it. Definitely just ensure full training. That's always important. That will help drive more self-efficacy. Explaining how those practices can fit into their everyday life, because some people might feel like, yeah, the idea is great and I know how to do it, but I don't see how I'm going to plug this in. Giving them time to think about what it would be like to plug it in would actually help. And then reflect on previous successes helping students. Hey, you know, there's been other times where you didn't think you were going to be implementing well doing this thing, but remember how this turned out? So those are just general targeted, I shouldn't say general, those are targeted potential solutions for these kinds of problems. And then really quickly, if we have post-intenders, I will just say this general idea. These are people who are already bought in, but they are not implementing yet. How do you attack that problem? There's two things. There's action planning and then there's coping planning. So action planning is, well, here, this statement would be optimally effective planning interventions should adopt if-then plan. I can't wait. Step one, dedicated individual planning time. Set aside time for people who already know what they're supposed to do and know what they want to do. Give them 90 minutes to just sit down and take the list of here's the expected practices and work out how are they going to actually do that in their own classroom. Think, you know, say, hey, think about the routines in your classroom when you're lecturing, when you're doing group work, when you're doing whatever. Here's this practice that we want to be happening. How could that work? And just give them planning time. So then they can start thinking about it and mentally rehearsing and realizing, okay, I can make it work like this, etc. That is something that really helps people move from I intend to do it to I actually will do it. And then publicly sharing commitments actually helps too. So it's one thing to be personally committed, but once you tell everybody else you're going to do something, that seems to be a huge predictor of intention to action. So maybe you can get them together into groups where they just say, here's what I'm going to be doing in my classroom. And as soon as you've said it, you feel this like social pressure, like, okay, I guess I'm actually going to do that thing now because now people heard me say it. So that's just good old social psychology. So publicly sharing commitment and giving them time to think about the realities of the specific practices. And then coping planning really quickly is just also after they've done that, then give them time to think about what happens if things go poorly? What are some impediments that might happen when I try to implement this stuff? And then give them time to work out their own solutions. So really, it's just giving them dedicated time to work out what this will be like for themselves in their own reality. That is a lot of what helps people move from intention to action. So you get them to intend to be bought in through all these other supports. And then once you get them there, you can give them a little time to prep the realities of doing that work. So to wrap up very quickly, what is buy-in? Well, it's reported to be important implementation. People think it's important. It's multifaceted. It's on a continuum, and it's not well researched. To address buy-in, there are some things we can do generally, which are basically ensure voice and ensure knowledge. And then we can think about how could we change people whose problems are driven by very specific things, right? These professional identity, attitudes, norms, and efficacy. And then finally, always feel free to go look at other sources for general tips and suggestions. I want us to all feel empowered to use whatever might work, because we don't know yet what is definitely most effective. Okay, that's what I have for understanding and dealing with buy-in today. Hopefully you'll be able to take a few of those ideas and do something with it. And I will definitely be back once we have more concrete guidance on some of these things. But that's the state of things, and best of luck in your efforts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Felter. There is a lot to think about in that, and we will definitely look forward to having you back for what you find.